Education funding remains uncertain, and campaigning is going strong for the March primary. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state government, sometimes the federal government, and how it just might affect your life. I'm Bernie Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register. We are going to see more and more ads on those commercial stations, but here we have time to talk about it and explain it.
And it's ad-free, thankfully.
Ad-free, there you go, with all those nice sponsors. Anyway, Charlie Wheeler is here again, Director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program at the University of Illinois Springfield, longtime Chicago Sun-Times State House reporter before that. Charlie, welcome.
Thank you, Bernie. It's always good to be here.
And Andy Maloney, State House Bureau Chief for Chicago Daily Law Bulletin, our legal eagle. Welcome back.
Good to be back.
Okay. So, education funding. I guess, Charlie, you've been covering this for a little while. And the State Board of Education is sometimes more independent than other times, but this year they have come forward and said, give us almost twice the amount of funding for K through 12. Give us another $7+ billion for K through 12 this year. Of course, that's just a recommendation to the governor, who's going to propose his budget by mid-February. What does this mean? Because the state really can't afford that right now, can it?
Probably not. No, what it means, in my judgment, the State Board is doing what it should do. The State Board is saying we passed this new funding formula for schools. We look at each individual school district. We don't have some one-size-fits-all foundation level, but rather we look at the demographics of the school district. How many low-income kids? How many special education kids? How many kids are learning English as a second language? And what are the requirements, the resources needed to be able to educate those children? And you come out with a number for each school district, and then you compare it to local resources. And the difference, some school districts have 3 times what they need to meet the needs of their kids. Some only have 40% of what's needed, including the people who are now down at 40. It's going to require this additional $7 billion. And people say, oh, that's crazy. Well, yeah, it's not going to happen. And as a matter of fact, the Governor's Commission, which met and recommended going to this evidence-based formula, as it's called, suggested we may have to phase this in over 10 years. But on the other hand, the board is saying, here's what you need. And it harkens back to the day. You mentioned I was a longtime reporter for the Sun-Times. That's true. I mean, I was there when the delegates of the Constitutional Convention decided the state should be the primary responsibility for funding education.
Which hasn't happened yet, and we're down to about 25%.
Yeah, but back in my day, the state board would routinely say, here's how much money is needed to cover what school districts are entitled to under the existing formula. And the governors would always say, Governor Thompson, Governor Egger, they'd always say, thank you very much, this is all we can afford, so we're going to prorate it. And that was the understanding. It was expected that the state board would say, here's what is really needed, and then the further expectation was, yeah, but we can't afford it.
Right, well, that's true. And Andy, I know there's other complications with the school funding formula because the legislature passed a trailer bill for the new formula, which Governor Honor actually vetoed something like it, and and his amendatory veto, whatever, was overridden, and or whatever exactly happened. But the Democratic plan is what passed, with State Senator Andy Maloney leading the charge over a period of time. But then a trailer bill, including this program where people can donate money to a foundation, and there can be scholarships for non-public schools. Up to $100 million of them, and you can get a tax credit for up to like $75 million. And the governor mandatorily vetoed that trailer bill, saying, well, there's maybe 200 schools that are registered with the state, if not approved yet, on a list by the State Board of Education that I want to be included, or that should be included, that some of them serve low-income students in the city of Chicago, et cetera. So let's make this change. And then Andy Maloney and the State Board of Education have both said, this could just gum up the works and not get money to schools where we are. Any word on if when the legislature comes back they're going to try to override the governor on that?
Well, you would expect them it to at least be at the forefront, right? This was another opportunity for, as soon as the veto was announced, just waves and waves of reaction talking about, and for good reason, this was the biggest issue, holding up a budget at the end of that impasse. Once the budget and the tax increase were passed, it was all about school funding. The negotiations were tough. Senator Menard has been talking about this for years and years. And then the trailer bill, I don't think, was on a lot of people's radars.
It really wasn't.
And I had to look at it again and be like, okay, now wait, what is this again?
Right.
But it would certainly be, it should be at the forefront of their agenda. The first time they can sort of approve everything and put it into play is, I believe, January 30th is when the Senate is back. But whether someone brings this to the table immediately
Right.
or not,
and I think
it's hard to say.
I believe it's LaShawn Ford, state representative from Chicago, who's saying, I like some of the changes the governor made. I like some of those schools to get
Right.
money. So there's not like a united Democratic front to say, let's just override the governor and move forward. What's also interesting about this, of course, is that Governor Rauner, after having vetoed education funding plans up until the final one passed, has then called it like his top accomplishment of last year.
Yeah.
And so now there's this wrench in the middle of it, which he says will improve it. Just approve my mandatory veto and we'll be fine. But Charlie, nothing is ever simple in Springfield.
No, it's not. And the governor waited so long before he issued the mandatory veto.
I think it was the last possible day.
The last
right?
possible day. And it was a technical bill in the sense that some of the language had to be cleared up. There were, I guess, drafting errors. And so had he just signed the bill, that would have been fine. But his problem was that there are certain schools that have not completely gone through the process that the state requires for non-public schools to be fully recognized. They've kind of filled in one form that says, take us on our word, we're doing what we ought to, but they haven't gone through the more rigorous process that involves inspections by state officials to make sure that, in fact, they are doing what they're supposed to do. Now, many of these schools are in that process, it just hasn't been done yet. And the governor's point is, well, if we don't change the law to allow them to participate, they'll miss out on this first year. And because it's a limited program, if they miss out on the first year, they may never get in. On the other side are the people who argue, look, why do you want to mess up funding for hundreds and hundreds of local school districts because of this handful of private schools that aren't up to snuff according to the state records?
Or at least have not yet been recognized.
They haven't been recognized as being up to snuff
later.
by the state. Yeah, so it's in my mind, I can't figure out why he's doing it. It would have been better just to sign the bill and then come back and introduce a separate piece of legislation to deal with this issue.
You are obviously not on his staff.
No.
But you're from the outside.
I'm always willing to give advice.
There we go. That's great. One other thing, Andy, Susana Mendoza, the state comptroller, Democrat, who has been a bit of a thorn in the side of the governor as he moves forward, put out a video in the last week saying, Governor, I'm calling on you to propose a balanced budget. Outside groups like PolitiFact Illinois have said that your last three budgets that you introduced actually were not balanced. One example would be last year's budget that he proposed included in it a line that said $4.5 billion of a grand bargain to be negotiated in the Senate, which ended up never making it to fruition. Democrats said that the Republicans all pulled off because the governor didn't want it. The governor never exactly said that, but they had said through that and another compromise they were working on that he would be okay with the tax increase. He now says the tax increase was passed over his veto and it's a Democratic one, even though there were Republican votes ultimately. So Mendoza and others are saying, or Mendoza in particular, Governor, let's get a real balanced budget proposal from you this year. Now, the State of the State address is January 31st. The budget address is Valentine's Day, February 14th. Are we going to see?
Which is also Ash Wednesday. So.
Are we going to see a balanced budget proposal from the governor this year, as the Constitution apparently says he's supposed to? Actually, not really says he's supposed to.
I would not necessarily count on it. You mentioned the budget last year that just had a line item for grand bargain to be negotiated. And previous budgets have also had similar problems. Charlie can talk in depth about all sorts of budget chicanery and
we
games
love it when
that people
Charlie is
play.
among the reporters at budget briefings from an administration because he knows where the bodies are buried. Anyway, go
Correct.
ahead.
But this strikes me as sort of a preliminary attack by Mendoza and some of the other Democrats. They know that there's probably a pretty good chance they're going to find some holes in Governor Rauner's budget. I mean, there's a lot of assumptions sometimes that you have to bake into a budget, although, the governor hasn't been totally forthcoming about the holes in his. They know they're going to be able to find some holes, and they're going to be able to dig. We said, hey, we called for a balanced budget. You didn't do it. This is the 4th year in a row, or however many years in a row. And I just always think back whenever the comptroller does something like this, puts out a video, puts out a statement or something, that special election after Judy Bar Topinka passed away. I mean, the Democrats had to come in, pass a special law to get an election sooner.
For the last 2 years of Topinka's
Correct.
term.
Susanna Mendoza has been very much a thorn in the governor's side, and so that has been a pretty significant change, I think, just in terms of the news coverage.
She's a
and
voice for the
day-to-day
Democratic
politics.
side that doesn't come
Correct.
necessarily from
And I'm
the
not sure a
legislature.
comptroller has ever played that big of a role, at least in terms of the politics. Maybe Charlie can talk more about that.
I would say that comptrollers historically have been thorns in governors' sides, even when they were of the same party, and particularly when they're of differing parties. And part of it is the comptroller is the person who has to write the checks and the person who has to tell someone who's waiting for a payment, I'm sorry, we don't have the cash in the bank. And that's been the case for the state basically for quite some time. And the governor can always come out and pontificate and blame the comptroller. So yeah, comptrollers are in a difficult situation. And will the governor propose a balanced budget? Not really. And one question is, how do you define a balanced budget? Is at the end of the year, when we have enough money in the bank at the end of the fiscal year to pay the outstanding bills and still have left over, does that mean it's balanced? We haven't had one of those since
Right. And we have
2001.
more than $8 billion, I think.
Or does it mean that your
in past bills still
that your
do.
deficit is declining? Well, we haven't had one of those since I believe 2015. So no, I mean, as of this morning, our bill backlog was $9.2 billion.
Over 9, okay, yeah.
And when we ended fiscal 17 on June 30th, well, actually at the end of the lapse period spending 2 months later, the deficit was $7,984 million. So is there any possibility that he's going to come up with a budget that accounts for that accounts for additional spending for pensions, that accounts for human services, that accounts for a lot of other stuff that's going to go up? No.
Right.
Now, he'll have a line in there, oh, we're going to get $10 billion from this diamond mine that's underneath the lawn of the Capitol, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, we'll see what happens. It is also true, and I think just perspective-wise, when there's a Democratic governor, Republicans all take issue with whatever speech the governor gives and whatever budget the governor proposes, because the governor proposes and then the legislature disposes, or at least works with it, and so you can always find. And what you're saying, Charlie, just about debts and meeting real obligations, I guess that gives Governor Rauner some backing when he says, I haven't seen a real balanced budget in decades in Illinois, because you can always argue that numbers are played with, although things have gotten pretty bad under his tenure, but that's because we had 2 years without a budget at all.
Yeah.
So.
Whereas we had spending that was ordered by law, for example, for pensions, for paying off the bonds that we've sold. We had a judge in St. Clair County saying you have to pay salaries.
Right.
We also had a number of agreements with federal courts that we would pay certain amounts of money for human services. Now, I, for one, don't see how the governor can make any cuts in those areas. You can't go in and tell a federal judge, well, we really need to make some economy, so we're going to lay off half of these people that we've been working with. Now, the federal judges don't buy that kind of stuff.
So we'll have to see where it goes, because the governor is also talking about he wants to reduce the tax on individuals through the tax increase passed over his objection last year with Democratic and some Republican votes, is 4.95%. He wants it to go back down to 3%, or he keeps saying that, but if he actually proposes that and proposes the cuts to go with it, I would be surprised, because they would be very deep cuts. And we'll see where that goes. We are moving forward in campaign season. And as we tape this, we have heard from the Rauner campaign that in major media markets, he's going to buy blocks of time on TV stations across the state, apparently. I'm not sure if it's all of them, showing like the full 11, or it's not the full 11 minutes because I watched what's on the website of the Rauner campaign with this ad, and it's a 15-minute ad with talking about Rod Blagojevich caught on FBI tape, talking to J.B. Pritzker, the certainly heaviest spending Democratic candidate for governor, back in 2008, and I think a little after that, maybe 2009 too, and I guess it was 2008, talking about, well, if I name you to the U.S. Senate, which J.B. Pritzker didn't really want, how does that work? And Pritzker is kind of angling in these conversations to be named state treasurer if that were to come open. If the treasurer at the time, Alexis Giannoulias, were somehow named to the U.S. Senate, he thought that would be a good idea because he's a business guy. Now, Pritzker was never charged with anything, but the Rauner campaign basically is painting him as a Blagojevich crony, and this is the Democratic corruption that you'll get with Pritzker. Pritzker has other Democratic candidates in his own race. Rauner is running against Jeannie Ives, the state representative in the Republican primary, but he is trying to apparently take Pritzker out now. Will a 15-minute ad help with this tape?
I think it's fair to say that in Illinois politics for the last 10 years, Blagojevich has been a four-letter word, even though it has many more letters than that. So any association that candidates bring to bear with the former governor is always a negative. And I think J.B. Pritzker has had some issues figuring out how to respond to this, right? He said he was always interested in public service, and that's really what the conversation reveals. But I would think that any sort of attention that the current governor, Governor Rauner, draws to something like that versus the budget impasse or versus President Trump or versus any number of things that have happened on Governor Rauner's watch is negative for Pritzker. Any attention that gets drawn to him is negative. Obviously, like you said, he's got his own primary fight that he has to worry about first in a crowded
even though I
Democratic
guess
field.
there's a recent poll that shows Rauner doesn't have much problem, it doesn't look like, because Jeannie Ives doesn't have a lot of money and isn't known by a majority of the people in Illinois yet.
Right, and as an incumbent and as somebody who's trying to, run statewide in Illinois, normally the hard-right conservative candidate, you would think, would be at a little bit of a disadvantage. So the governor doesn't seem to necessarily be too worried about Jeannie Ives and sort of going straight for the general election play in some facets. So I don't know that this will make an appreciable dent in anybody's poll numbers, but it's certainly a strategy that he believes is worth
he's
pursuing.
probably trying to do to Pritzker what Rod Blagojevich did to Judy Bartopinka, who was running for governor after one term of Blagojevich, where there was just tape of Judy Bartopinka doing the polka with George Ryan, a Republican governor who had gotten into legal trouble himself and ended up doing time in prison, and was able to kind of paint him. But I don't know if it will work in this case because the Pritzker people are super funded, and they're attacking back at Governor Rauner with ads of their own and basically saying he doesn't have accomplishments, so he's attacking us instead. And we were just talking politics there. So,
well, it strikes me, a 15-minute commercial, who's going to sit there and watch the whole thing? I mean, one of the greatest gifts to the citizenry was when the remote control device was developed with the mute button.
Well, we'll see how many people use that or just flip channels, as often happens. There was another situation last week. The Martin Luther King Day holiday has come and gone. On that day, the governor was on a African-American oriented radio station in Chicago, WVON. There had been some discussion of difficult comments President Trump made in the Oval Office about various countries and where people should come from or not, particularly African countries and Haiti. The governor was asked if President Trump was a racist, and he basically said the language that he is allegedly to have used, doesn't belong in political discourse. And the posts there, including Charles Thomas, who used to be a TV reporter from Chicago and now is on the radio, were saying, well, why can't you say more, Governor? What about David Duke? Is he a racist? And the governor really basically said, well, we have racism in society. And David Duke, of course, a former head of the Ku Klux Klan and has his own website and stuff. So the governor didn't really answer that question, just said, we're a racist society, Illinois is broken, we have to be better, the African American community has been hurt by our bad policies, of those before me. And then later that day, after he was attacked, after Governor Rauner was attacked for not calling David Duke a racist by J.B. Pritzker and others, then the governor's campaign put out a statement, well, of course he thinks that David Duke is a racist. Charlie, how does this play, and does the governor hurt himself at all politically there?
To me, it's just amazing how this guy passes up the opportunity to score easy points. How difficult it is to say, yes, David Duke is a racist, no doubt about it. Look at his history. Yeah, and particularly in a state like Illinois, where the Ku Klux Klan, there are people alive today who can recall when the Ku Klux Klan, what's the right word, when the Ku Klux Klan harassed, threatened, brutalized people.
Yeah, well, even in my reporting lifetime, there was a march that said that they were the Klan at the State House.
Yeah,
after certain developments, I don't know, about 15 or 20 years ago.
That's not a difficult thing. It was kind of an easy thing for him to say.
Yeah. And especially because the same thing happened to the President of the United States when he was running for office, right? He had a similar flap where he didn't denounce David Duke or the Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah, he said, I don't really know much about David Duke. That's what the President Trump said.
And the same thing in Charlottesville when, we have, there were bad people on both sides, when it's just so easy to say that Nazis are bad or the KKK is bad and all of these things. It's interesting because during campaigns especially, politicians don't mind sort of foregoing nuance. It strikes me as when you get a question like that, probably not the best time to split hairs and try to make a nuanced point.
Well, and if you think about, I don't want to offend part of my base. Were I a politician, I would not want those kinds of people in my base.
Understood. Yeah. Well,
I would tell them to go somewhere else because I don't share their views. I don't believe in what they believe in. I'm certainly not going to promote their ideology, and so thank you, but I don't want your support.
Understood. Well, the governor also made it to Lincoln for an appearance this week, talking about, he signed a bill to create a women's division in the Department of Corrections to provide, extra kind of training and counseling and realizing that, these are mothers and that there may be a different way to try to keep people out of prison once they get out of prison. Charlie, the governor has actually worked with Democrats a lot on corrections. It's kind of one area where Democrats and Republicans under this administration have gotten along. The bill that he signed was actually sponsored by Juliana Stratton, who is J.B. Pritzker's running mate. And so your thoughts, I think you have some statistics of, the governor has talked about wanting to get, a quarter reduction in the number of people in Illinois prisons, and he has made progress there with the help of both sides.
Yeah, and to me that's an example of how the system is supposed to work and how it generally worked back in the day, where the two sides would sit down, they'd each have their priorities, they'd figure out where they could meet in the middle, and then they'd come to some agreement. And that's what happened on this corrections stuff. So I looked up, the Department of Corrections puts out a quarterly report saying, here's how many people are in prison, here's what the capacity is of the prisons, here's the people in educational programs, and so on. And the one that came out on January 1st, of this year, said that as of November 30th, there were 42,120 individuals incarcerated in the facilities. And that is actually about 12% fewer than when Rauner first took office. So he's like halfway to his goal of reducing the prison population by 25%. And it's being done through changes in licensing, through better follow-up, through more targeted educational programs, and in particularly in the case of this women's division, it's to provide the kind of psychological counseling because there's, from what I've read, there's a disproportionate number of women who have been abused, who have been victimized themselves before they turn to crime. So those are very good forward-looking steps. That's the kind of stuff the governor should be talking about instead of spending his time throwing stones at people.
Yeah, interesting. And I know, Andy, kind of legalization of marijuana is something that could end up over time reducing prison population even more significantly, and that's been a matter of debate in the campaign. I'm not exactly sure if we should expect any 2018 action on this, but the governor has said total legalization not good. We have medical marijuana. J.B. Pritzker wants legalization. Kennedy wants to watch it and not go all the way. Biss wants legalization. Any idea where that one goes, or is Illinois just going to have to wait till after 2018?
Yeah, I think the smart money is on waiting until after 2018. The governor has signed a bill. We talk about the reduction in prison population and sort of the maybe decriminalizing this to an extent. He did sign a bill that was a Democrat-sponsored bill, making it basically small amounts of possession a civil violation. But I would say that this is going to be something that continues to be talked about, even beyond the election. And look, we've got 2 Republicans in the race for Attorney General. One of them says legalization is a good idea. The other one said they're okay with it. So a Republican primary election, we have 2 candidates talking about, maybe marijuana legalization isn't bad. So that's
I thought
sort
that
of an
state's attorney,
indication.
or is it a state's attorney? No, he's a county official.
Gary Grasso.
Yeah.
Is that he said he would look at
He
it,
would
continue
look at
to
it.
monitor
Look at
it.
it,
There's an openness. It may be a
and
little
Erica
bit
Harold
of
is more open to it.
Is
and
more
thinks-
open to it,
yeah,
but-
because we've had some prominent Republicans talk about it.
But I think that's where it's trending.
Yeah, and just to show how things move along, it's only been a couple of weeks since the governor spent, 6 nights or so at the Veterans Home in Quincy, where they had Legionnaire's disease outbreak, said that there would be a plan. Jeannie Ives has now gone there, has talked about replacing buildings or some of the whole thing. Senators Duckworth and Durbin, both Democrats, have now asked Governor Rauner for a copy of his plan. And this just happened late in the week. Show us what you were talking about when you left there and said that the state would have a plan to fix this. As we tape this, we don't know where that's going, but this will be a continuing. There's going to be another hearing, I think, February 1st. So I think we should look for, I don't know if it's fireworks, but at least more explanation of where that's going.
Definitely a time for more people to put out statements and introduce legislation and resolutions to keep the conversation going.
Okay, with that, we are just about out of time. Charlie Wheeler and Andy Maloney, thanks for joining me. Thank you for watching. Legislature will be coming in, I think within days in the House, and by the end of the year, or month in the Senate.
In the Senate, yeah.
So we'll be watching, and thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time on Capitol View.